All right, ladies, now that we've talked about Osama bin Laden, who again you see pictured on the cover slide right here, we can talk a little more specifically about the background of what has come to be in Afghanistan. We're going to start in the late 70s again, and it goes all the way back to 1978. At that time, Afghan communists, and remember the United States favoring democracy and capitalism, was sort of battling the communist world, in particular the Soviet Union, that we'll talk about in a minute. So in 78, we've got Afghan communists staging a revolution to try to take over the government of Afghanistan. Now, the traditional Muslims in the country were not in favor of this, so they were fighting back against it. Sort of the old thing where if two people have the same enemy, then those two people are at least sort of temporarily friends. So these traditional Muslims and actually got some help from the United States, which I'll mention in a minute, and they are fighting back against these communists. Meanwhile, the communists in the second point there get some help from the Soviet Union. Communist Soviet Union came to the aid of the Afghan communists, and this turns into what's known as the Soviet-Afghan War. Soviet-Afghan War, which ended up killing 1.5 million people and causes all kinds of other destruction as well. And as I mentioned, you've got the United States actually helping the Taliban, this fairly extreme Muslim group. Actually, they were part of a larger group, as I mentioned in the last thing, called the Mujahideen. But the United States actually helping the Taliban, sending them money and weapons, because remember, this is the middle of the period known as the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two most powerful countries in the world. And the United States was desperate to stop the spread of communism, which they thought was very problematic. So the United States ends up helping the Taliban to fight off the communists so that they wouldn't take over. Fast forward a few years to 1989, the Soviet Union itself, big, powerful Soviet Union, formerly one of the two most powerful countries in the world, comes crashing down. It goes back to being Russia and several other smaller countries. And of course, at that time, and shortly before that, they pull out of Afghanistan and don't have a presence there anymore. That sounds like a good thing, but the problem is then everybody in Afghanistan kind of looks at each other and says, oh, what do we do next? We're not totally sure what's going on here. So a lot of groups end up fighting to decide who's going to be in control next. And a civil war breaks out in Afghanistan. But by the year 2000, this extreme Muslim group, the Taliban, had taken control of the country. Now, the interesting thing about the Taliban, actually, was that not everyone in the Taliban necessarily agreed to what level of Islamic strictness, maybe we could say, was going to exist within the country. There were those who actually wanted a more modern lifestyle to exist within Afghanistan. But there were also many who wanted a more traditional, very strictly enforced Muslim lifestyle to exist. And ultimately, sort of the strict side wins out. So at the top there, we're talking about a more modern style versus a more traditional lifestyle. In the middle there, ultimately the Taliban uses very strict rules based on Islamic law for the middle one there, which we've also referred to as Sharia law earlier in the unit. And they use that are going to use that to govern people's behavior in the country. But the most significant thing going forward, and what we need to talk about in the next few slides, is that the Taliban ends up allowing a lot of terrorist groups, such as Al-Qaeda, which we mentioned when we were talking about bin Laden. They let groups like Al-Qaeda operate within their country. And eventually, this is going to give those groups room to plan, room to operate, and room to formulate plans ultimately that result in things like the big one, obviously, the attacks on New York and Washington and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on September 11th, 2001. So after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush is going to very quickly declare what he called a war on terror, a war on terrorism, there in the first point. And within a month, just less than a month later, on October 7th, 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom, ENDURING Freedom, starts, and the goal there is to seize the terrorists' financial assets, meaning, cut off their money supply wherever we can, and destroy their infrastructure, whatever, physical structures they have in place that are going to allow them to succeed. And Enduring Freedom included several countries, meant to fight back after 9/11, but certainly it was a U.S.-led coalition, a U.S.-led group of countries. And obviously their target by this point was the Taliban, that group we just talked about, a fundamentalist Muslim political group, because they were, at this point, known to be, or had been, protecting Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda group, his terrorist group. By March of 2002, these coalition forces had taken over Kabul, Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan had basically sort of fallen to the American-led coalition, and they'd taken other important cities as well. Unfortunately, Osama bin Laden and his fellow terrorists were long gone by that point. They were nowhere to be found. The side note that we already talked about is that we ultimately do get bin Laden about 9 years after that in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. But he was nowhere to be found in Afghanistan in 2002 after we had taken their capital of Kabul. So the United States starts to help out with rebuilding Afghanistan and moving them towards a new democracy. And in 2004, Afghanistan adopts a new constitution, a new democratic constitution. Constitution is the word you need there. And they elect a guy named Hamid Karzai. I'm going to spell that for you. Hamid Karzai, Hamidkarzai. They elect Hamid Karzai to run the country. He's basically the first president of the new democracy in Afghanistan. He actually had some pretty good goals to bring more civil liberties and education improvements. Things don't end up going quite as well for him as people had hoped at the outset. He seemed like he was a well-intentioned person, but some things ended up going wrong later. Today, of course, to some degree, we're still fighting insurgents. The Taliban itself is trying to retake control in Afghanistan. We have the goal of making it more secure. Operation Enduring Freedom has officially ended. I believe it was 2014 when we sort of officially pulled those combat troops out, but there are still limited U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and certainly it's still a very unstable country. These are just a couple of images for you real quick here of some of the combat operations in Afghanistan, and the guy in the bottom right there is Hamid Karzai, who is the president of Afghanistan from 2004 to 2014. So he served 2 5-year terms and obviously was president of Afghanistan for 10 years. Afghanistan today is actually one of the poorest countries in the world. And most people there are involved in probably one of 3 things in terms of making their living or making money. The first one being farming, which you expect in a lot of undeveloped countries. The second being animal herding. And the third one is actually the opium trade. O-P-I-U-M. Opium is it comes from poppy plants actually. It's a very, very addictive drug. And the modern street drug heroin is actually derived from opium. And you probably have heard at some point about how problematic that drug is and how addictive it can be. So that's a bit of an issue there as well. There are terrific mineral resources, the third point down there, terrific mineral resources in the country. Unfortunately, the constant instability in the country and the war that's been continuously going on there has basically kept their economy from growing. It's one thing to have great resources, but if you really don't have the systems and the infrastructure in place to get them out and make use of them, it doesn't really matter what resources you might have lying within your country. Hamid Karzai was actually re-elected to a second term as president in 2009, although some people believe that election may have been sort of riddled with fraud and maybe not contested honestly. And ultimately, his tenure ends up being kind of corrupt in a number of different ways. And he's replaced, after serving a second term, a new man was elected in 2014, Ashraf Ghani, and obviously he is now the president of Afghanistan very early in his first term on the job. So that's a little bit of background about what happened in Afghanistan since the late 70s that has led up to the turmoil that still exists there today. So you guys enjoy the rest of your digital day, and I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow when you have all this complete.